Hey everybody, this is a video I've been thinking about for some time. Really, I've been thinking about putting this together since I finished Tim Perry's wonderful little book, When Politics Becomes Heresy, which I posted a video review of a few weeks ago. So if you didn't watch that video review, you don't know what I'm talking about, you maybe check that out first, because this is going to be really pulling on some specific points he makes in this book. But I really liked how he handled the specific concept of heresy. I thought he brought some clarifying language to that, and it really got my gears turning. And it got my gears turning specifically on the use of the term heretic, and whether or not the situations in which that term is applicable and not applicable, and how actually thinking more carefully about that can shed light on Christian doctrine and Christian practice, especially in a very contentious time. Like, we live in such a contentious, disputatious time, especially in online discourse, that I really care about kind of pumping the brakes a little bit and thinking much more carefully and clearly about boundaries around concepts like heresy and doctrine. And anyways, thinking about it, reflecting on it since I read his book has been really helpful for me, and I just wanted to put out some observations, some questions, some thoughts in this video format. And specifically, he kind of poses, I'll read a few passages from the book in a minute, but he poses kind of three layers to the concept of heresy, that each layer I think is helpful, and when you combine them especially, it really helps zero in on what actually we're talking about when we talk about something like heresy, and on the other side of the coin, what we're not talking about. And I kind of just wanted to step through those three layers and maybe give an observation on each. The third layer is going to tee up, and then the third layer is going to tee up some observations and some open-ended questions for how to maybe move forward in a more helpful way, or at least it's going to tee up some questions that are real live questions that I have thinking about Christian unity in 2025 as I'm recording this video. So yeah, that's what I want to do in this video, is I kind of want to define heresy and then peel apart those layers a little bit. But what Tim Perry does in this book, which I really like, is he actually uses the language in the Catholic Catechism for heresy, which is it's a really helpful definition. And so he quotes the Catechism and then pulls it apart, or not deconstructs it, but essentially just analyzes it. And so that's what I want to follow here. I want to follow that model. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church says this about heresy, that it is the obstinate post-baptismal denial of some truth which must be believed with divine and Catholic faith, or it is likewise an obstinate doubt concerning the same. Okay, that's the quote from the Catechism. So the first thing to observe about this definition is that heresy is post-baptismal. That's the verbiage used here. So what that means, this is the first layer of the three. The first layer here is that heresy can only be found, or can only be upon the lips, so to speak, of a person who has entered the church. That's how I take the language of post-baptismal. There's obvious differences in different Christian traditions as to how baptism is practiced and kind of theological and sacramental understandings of the practice. But bracketing those off for a moment and just, I think, focusing on the kind of the base layer, so to speak, of baptism is, I think it's fair to say baptism is a ritual of entering the church, a ritual of entering the people of God. And so to say that heresy is something that is post-baptismal is to say heresy can only be committed by someone who is in the church, someone who is in the people of God, someone who is in the body of Christ, post-baptismal. This may seem at first like an obvious point, but I think it's really important to emphasize, especially, and this is my observation about this first layer, is that someone who is not claiming to be in the church, someone who's not claiming to be a member of the body of Christ, cannot actually be a heretic, and it is inappropriate to label that person a heretic. The example that comes to my mind right now is and by the way, if you can hear noise around me, there's construction happening around my office. I apologize for that. It's the only time I could record. Anyways, the helpful point, hopefully, from this layer is to say that, the deconstruction movement, the ex-evangelical movement, people who are explicitly moving away, and I know that movement has a lot of diversity within it, and not everyone who would call themselves ex-evangelical would say that they're not Christian anymore, but there are a lot of people who have moved in this progressive deconstructive kind of trajectory who would say, I am not a Christian anymore, like I am explicitly post-Christian, or I've apostatized, or whatever. People who have moved in that direction therefore are not heretics because they're not claiming to be in the church. And I think that's really important. So it's just, you can't call someone who has moved outside of the faith a heretic. They're not committing heresy. They've apostatized. That's different. That's a different thing. And so immediately we can get some more clarity and some more precision around the use of this term. But that's just the first layer. The second layer, I think, gets a little more interesting, which is around the use in that catechism's definition of the term obstinate. So obstinate is another word for stubborn. And this gets at a kind of a willful action, a willful choice, you could say. And the Greek term heresis is where we get the English heresy, and that Greek term means basically to choose. And so I find this is another helpful layer to add on top of the first layer of being post-baptismal. So someone who is in the body of Christ and is maintaining an obstinate or a stubborn or a willful choice to believe something that is not in alignment with the teaching of the church. That's essentially what the second layer is that stubborn, willful action, that use of agency to claim a different belief. And this, I think, is really helpful. The way Tim Perry phrases it is that heresy is as much the attitude in which a belief is held as its actual content. It is the obstinate assertion of self-will over against the mind of the Church Universal, while insisting that one nevertheless remains a Christian. That is a really, really helpful phrase, because it gets at a really deep tension within heresy, which is to say, this is what also sets heresy apart from deconverting or apostatizing. Apostatizing is saying, okay, I no longer believe all this stuff and I'm not part of the church anymore. Heresy is to say, no, I'm part of the church and the rest of the church is actually wrong about something. Like, what I believe about what it means to be a Christian is the correct thing, and everyone else's, or the majority of people, or the leadership, or whatever, the magisterium, whatever it is, the tradition is wrong. They're wrong, I'm right, I am a Christian. By definition, the others are not. This zeroes in more helpfully, and it kind of puts some boundaries around what it actually means to be a heretic. So someone that is holding to something that is in explicit disregard of what the church is actually teaching, while still maintaining that they are the ones who are Christian, that starts to help us get closer to what a heretic actually is. But we're still not to the third layer yet, which is the third thing I want to get to, and this is going to open up this layer. This third layer, I'll just say before I get there, this layer opens up all kinds of questions, and this is where it's going to. I'm going to leave some of the questions open because I'm honestly still asking some of them. Nevertheless, here's the third layer. The third layer is that language of that which must be believed. Which must be believed with divine and Catholic faith is how the Catechism puts it. So the post-baptismal layer, claiming to be Christian, the obstinate, stubborn layer, but of nevertheless believing something different, and then the third layer is that different belief must be of something that must be believed. So in other words, it must be a core issue. It must be a matter of, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, of first importance, like the gospel I handed over to you was of first importance. The application of the term heresy must be on something that is of that level of importance. It must be at the center of the non-negotiable faith that's handed over once for all to the saints. And this is where we get to the rub. This is where we get to the beating heart of, I think, what's at stake here. Is the next question becomes, okay, well, what are the core issues, right? This is always what questions of heresy come back to. What is of first importance? What are the issues that are core? What are the issues that can be debated? What are the issues that can be a breadth of opinions can be held, and we still be in good faith holding to the teaching of the church and the gospel, and faithfulness to the gospel? And what are the issues that cannot be broken from? And this is where the questions just proliferate. This is where things become wide open, understandably so. And so that can be frustrating because it can be hard to get clarity on that. But I just want to tee up a few responses, a few thoughts, and a few questions about this. And then I am going to try to relate it a little bit to live questions for today. And so for me, to approach the question of what are the non-negotiable issues, what are the core issues that must be believed, a starting point is the ancient creeds, notably the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed in particular. So I've also been thinking about this because I'm neck deep in a teaching series. I'm a pastor and I'm teaching through the Nicene Creed. I'm actually teaching through the content of the Nicene Creed in a series of sermons. And so I've just been really deep in understanding the history of the Creed and how it was formulated and the doctrine behind it and the historical setting of it and all that stuff, which was a hotbed of what would become heresies. Heretical teachings are really the crucible of how the Nicene Creed was formed, which is why I think the Nicene Creed has stood the test of time literally for 1,700 years. That creed has been in good standing with all the major branches of global Christianity still say the Nicene Creed is good teaching. So that in itself is significant, that the Roman Catholic branch, the Eastern Orthodox branch, and the Protestant branch hold to the soundness of the Nicene Creed. So anyways, this is not a video on the Nicene Creed, but I do think a helpful starting point for discerning this question of what must be believed, what's in that core, what's in that non-negotiable terrain, that territory, a starting point for discerning that is looking at the creeds. And so if you look at the creeds in that way, you get a sense of what are some of the, again, this is just a starting point of the conversation, what are some of the most important things to be held to? And looking at the creeds, you start to get the sense that some of the things that are of most importance are the Trinitarian doctrine of the Godhead. I think that's very, very important in the creeds. Some other things that become really important are Christology, who is Christ, like the identity of Christ, the hypostatic union of divine and human in Jesus. Also I would say, so the Trinity, I would say the Christology, and then also the broad general historicity of the gospel story. That's also very important. That comes out very strongly in looking, even a cursory glance at the creeds. And the way that comes out is that the creeds name events and people. They name Mary and Pontius Pilate, and they name the events of the crucifixion, the burial, the death, and the resurrection, and the ascension of Christ, the descent and the ascent. And so the basic contours of the historicity of the gospel story, I think, are need to be believed. And so as a starting point for how to respond to this, what are matters of non-negotiable import, I would suggest the Trinity, Christology, and the basic historicity of the gospel story, right? And there's a ton of things left off of this list that I could get into. I mean, this is not, the doctrine of Scripture is not here. Mechanics of the atonement are not here. They're not really talked about in the creeds, which is really interesting. You can flash forward to all kinds of nitty-gritty in the weeds debates on the integration of science and the biblical story is not here. It's not in the creed, certainly. Eschatology, similarly, timelines of eschatology and eschatological events and how that's going to play out. Also, doctrines of heaven and hell are not in here. There's all kinds of stuff I'm not even touching on, but I think to just really drill into the starting point of trying to discern what is of ultimate importance, going back to those creeds, because they were forged in the early centuries of the church, the closest people to the apostolic teaching, and also because they were forged in the crucible of a lot of competing heretical ideas, notably the teachings of Arius, also the Gnostics in the centuries before. Because those are the things that were the pressure points for the forging of the creeds, they're really helpful as kind of a lens to use to try to figure out what are the matters of most importance that can then be determined to be heretical if someone is teaching something different. So I would say, to start to approach a positive example, I suppose, of when the label heretic could be used is, to go through our three layers, someone who is claiming to be a Christian, who is obstinately holding on to an alternate belief around the Trinity, for example. Someone who is not Trinitarian, or someone who is holding to an alternate belief around the historicity of the gospel story, that Jesus never died, right? Or that Jesus never resurrected, or that Jesus wasn't actually born of Mary, or that Jesus didn't suffer under Pontius Pilate, right? These are things that you can start to be on pretty firm ground to say, if someone is holding to Christian confession and stubbornly believing something that is not held to in these ancient creeds, I think that you can say, and hopefully not with bravado or brash whatever attitudes, but I think you can say with a descriptive clarity, this person is committing heresy. Again, because they're holding to Christian belief, but nevertheless maintaining that what they believe is not actually in line with the handed over teachings of these creedal belief statements. Okay, now this is all. You might say this is all well and good, but this does not approach the most contentious kind of hotbed issues of our time and our cultural issues. And so I'm going to just approach some of these questions, and I'm not going to land with a definitive statement of clarity on who is and is not a heretic when it comes to contentious cultural issues today. I'm more going to try to use this concept of heresy that's carefully defined in these 3 layers to approach a posture to see what kind of posture we can adopt as we discern who is and is not maybe committing heresy, or even if that term is appropriate to use. So let's just get right into what I think is probably some of the most contentious issue, which to me circles all around issues of anthropology. What I mean by that is understandings of who humans are, whether or not humans are sinful, and also the value of life, of human life specifically, and then flowing into, if your anthropology then flows into human identity, that also touches on the most contentious issues of our time, namely gender and sex and sexuality and sexual ethics, right? So these are all issues that I think you can couch all these things under matters of anthropology, and it's interesting that the ancient creeds don't really give us language. They were not pressing into issues of anthropology because the debates at the time were much more about metaphysics, the identity of God, and certainly Christological questions. But nevertheless, they don't give us we don't have a clear ancient ecumenical creed on matters of human identity, much less sexuality or gender or any of that, or abortion ethics or things like that. We just don't have it. So everything I just talked through doesn't necessarily give us the tools to get clarity on the question of heresy around some of the most contentious issues of our time. And I'm also speaking in an American evangelical context, and of course the year 2025 as I already mentioned. So a lot of these debates are culturally conditioned and culturally circumscribed. Think of in the time of the Magisterial Reformation, issues of the nature of the Eucharist were the hotbed lightning rod issues that were life and death, matters of life and death. It's just not the case for us today. So there are cultural conditions that ebb and flow that kind of create, they create parameters and conditions for these conversations and amplify them with stakes in certain times. And then there are times when those cultural things will go away and the matters will change. And so this is one of the tricky issues with naming heresy, is that if you get so wrapped up in what is so time-bound and culturally bound into your moment, and you can't reach outside of that moment and pull on ancient debates, ancient language, ancient writings, or just at least writings that are not of your time and place, if you can't really use those to speak to the most contentious issues of your own time. And this is what gets really tricky. So just to put the matter simply, we meaning the broad Christian tradition, much less Protestantism, which is so fractious right now, we just don't have a magisterium or a structure or a hierarchy to rely on to claim a boundary of heresy around issues of sexual ethics or gender identity, and go down to the other examples. We just don't have that. And if I could wave my magic wand and I could call a truly ecumenical council, I almost wonder if this is what would need to happen, is a truly ecumenical council, not just, this is the problem with things like the Nashville Statement or the Statement on Social Justice that John MacArthur was behind, or even the Chicago Statement on inerrancy from I think it was 1973, I believe, when that was published. These statements, you can debate the merits of the language of them and the individual clauses of them and whether or not they're good or not. You can debate all that stuff, but one overriding kind of concern is that they're all just within evangelicalism. They're not truly ecumenical, and so they really cannot speak to the broad church, the broad body of Christ globally and historically. They just can't. And so if I could wave my magic wand, I would assemble. I have no idea how this would work, and one of the major barriers is that just logistically, how would this even happen, and how would it be convened, and how would it be moderated, and all that stuff. But just if you do the thought experiment and bring together leaders of Protestantism, high church and low church, liturgical and non-liturgical, and include Pentecostal leaders in that, I think would be important, and Roman Catholic leaders and Eastern Orthodox leaders. If you could convene a council, and if that group could write a creedal declaration around issues of anthropology, then I think we might have something to say, okay, this is the broad teaching of the church. And if you're outside of that, if you are claiming to be a Christian post-baptismal, but you are holding to that you're holding to a different belief than that, then maybe we could use the label heretic. Now, of course, that's not going to happen. I don't see any way that that's going to happen. Which I think this is one reason why we can keep not lapsing, that's too negative a word, but keep reaching back to the Nicene Creed, because it's a really robust creed that does represent the beliefs of all the major branches of Christianity around the globe. We just don't have anything like that is more recent. Notable efforts have been made. Like, I think the Lausanne Covenant is a pretty admirable statement. If you're familiar with this, it was from John Stott. I believe it was in the 90s. I should have looked up the year before I did this video. It was at least 25 plus years ago. But it's a pretty robust statement that really, it also includes a lot of global representation in terms of the leaders who put that statement together, but it's just evangelical. It does not include Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodox. Another notable example is the effort to do the joint statement on justification, the joint declaration, which was I believe was initiated by a particular Lutheran denomination that actually reached out to kind of a subset of the Roman Catholic expression and has since folded in. I think the Anglican Communion is folded into that. That's a pretty notable, more ecumenical-minded attempt to bridge a major theological divide on the nature of justification. But even that doesn't include evangelicals or Protestants. Well, I guess Anglicans are Protestants, but it doesn't include, certainly not the Pentecostal wing. So even that's limited. So I'm just talking through these examples just to say, like, I think in order for heresy on matters of current-day cultural import that are very contentious and fractious, that are not spoken of directly in the creeds, what it would take for us to be able to have kind of solid footing is to say this is a heretical belief. I just don't know that we're going to have that. And so that tees up just the final questions that I have, and I'll be pretty open and honest with you about kind of how I'm processing this. It really makes me wonder, and it gives me some serious pause on what we can label heresy outside of issues of Christology, Trinitarian belief, basic historicity of the gospel story, et cetera, those things that are explicitly affirmed. It gives me real pause. Now, I am someone I've mentioned in a couple videos, maybe more in passing. I've never fleshed this out in depth, but I am someone who personally is convinced of a traditional understanding and an outworking of sexual ethics and gender as it relates to anthropology and human identity. I land in a traditional place on that stuff, and I can talk about why. I can give reasons for that. I can even talk about my story, which is something I've thought about. I've thought about doing a video on that in the past. But my point in saying that and even bringing that up is that I'm someone who holds to the understanding, and nevertheless I feel a certain wariness, caution about labeling people who think different than me heretics. If they claim to Christian faith and they hold, this is trying to land the plane on this, someone who thinks differently than me on sexual ethics, for example, but claims to Christian faith and claims to all those matters, those settled matters of historical heresies around the creed, someone who affirms robustly the Nicene Creed and nevertheless holds a different view than me on some of these issues, I'm not sure I can say they're a heretic. I'm just not sure I can. And then how do I then practically outworking from that when I think about Christian unity, which is something that's really, really important in the New Testament and the words of Jesus in John 17. If I think about matters of Christian unity, that tees up some really pressing and tense and I think important questions about how do we push for Christian unity, hold to with clarity and compassion and grace, but confidence, hold to beliefs that we hold and reasons for those beliefs and can articulate them and all of that, defend them. But then where's the rubber hit the road when it comes to breaking fellowship or declaring someone out of bounds? How does that all work? These are the questions that, thinking carefully and with precision through matters of heresy, these are the questions that it leads me to. And I have to be honest, part of the reason I want to do this video is to say, honestly, I'm not sure I have answers. I'm sure I don't have clear answers to some of that stuff right now, even though I have clear and I think confident and I think well-reasoned conclusions about some of these very contentious issues. But nevertheless, I don't know that the term heresy applies. I don't know that I can push around the term heresy. And certainly I don't advocate using the term heresy just for things that you're uncomfortable with, or just because you actually want to short-circuit conversation and just want to label someone out of bounds so you don't actually have to have the more difficult work of discussing it with them. That's certainly not the use of the term heresy, not appropriately at least. And so that's where I'm at. That's where I'm at on these issues, is I think shelving the term heresy on these topics for the sake of doing the deeper and harder work of modeling grace and trying to discern what does Christian unity look like here. I think that's the next question in our our cultural moment as we move forward. So, yeah, I can't land on a neat and tidy, put that in a neat and tidy bow and give you 3 applications and here, go and do likewise. I can't do that, but I wanted to talk through my reasoning process, and especially how this particular book and some of my studies around the creeds have been really helpful for me in pressing towards precision and hopefully more grace and confidence. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on heresy. I hope that you found this interesting, maybe provoke some thoughts and questions on your own. Please post away below. I'm sure you're not the only one that is thinking those things. So as always, thank you for taking a few minutes to watch.